We're connected to each other, and we should not be comfortable when most people are not succeeding.
Hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world are working to improve life and address imminent threats to humanity. Often their research ends up in the scientific valley of death in the form of publications and patents that never see the light of day. That is about to change. Welcome to the Lab to Startup podcast, hosted by Naresh Sunkara, founder and executive director of the Berkeley Postdoc Entrepreneurship Program at the University of California, Berkeley. This show has two main goals: share the stories of those who have successfully founded startups based on their own research, and highlight resources needed to help those aspiring to launch startups in the deep tech space. Whether it's electric cars, vaccines, addressing climate change concerns, or possibly establishing life on other planets, Naresh and his esteemed guests want to help scientists, engineers, faculty, and researchers bring their innovations to market. Learn more and subscribe today at labtostartup.com. And now, here's Naresh.
My guest today is Dr. Freeman Hrabowski III, President Emeritus of UMBC, the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, who served as president from 1992 to 2022. His research and publications focus on science and math education, with special emphasis on minority participation and performance. He chaired the National Academies Committee that produced the 2011 report, Expanding Underrepresented Minority Participation, America's Science and Technology Talent at the Crossroads. He was named in 2012 by President Obama to chair the President's Advisory Commission on Educational Excellence for African Americans. In 2022, Dr. Hrabowski was elected to the National Academies of Engineering. In addition, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute, HHMI, also launched the Freeman Hrabowski Scholars Program, a $1.5 billion fund to help build a scientific workforce that fully reflects our increasingly diverse country. In 2022, he was named the inaugural Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. commemorative lecturer speaker by Harvard. Because of such extensive experience as a leader contributing and advancing diversity in academia, I could not think of anyone better than Dr. Hrabowski as a guest to speak on today's topic, translating lessons learned on diversity from academia to startups and the tech world. In this episode of Lab to Startup, we talk about the state of diversity in academia, the challenges, experiments, and outcomes, how diversity is a hard problem, and topics like the pipeline issues, hiring, mentoring, building culture, and several others that academia has made some progress in, and how tech industry could extract lessons from the work done in academia. I consider myself very lucky to be mentored by Dr. Hrabowski during my grad school days at UMBC, and I hope there'll be plenty of lessons for everyone thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in the tech industry from my conversation today. Dr. Hrabowski, I'm super excited to have you on my show today. I know how busy you are and so thankful that you kindly accepted my invitation. And I've been thinking about where to start our conversation, and it makes most sense to cover the ground from your own journey in higher education at Hampton College, where you went to undergrad, until the time you recently retired at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, UMBC. Maybe you can provide the state of the union on diversity in higher education during this period. I'm taking this approach because this will set the stage for our discussion about the progress made, hurdles overcome, and lessons that tech industry could potentially extract from your own journey.
Sure. So first of all, Naresh, I know you're not accustomed to it, but please call me Freeman. Please, let's be very informal here, okay?
I'll try.
Yes. So let me just say that when I went to college at Hampton University back in the late 60s, only 10% of Americans could say that people in their families have gone and graduated from college. 10% in general, and it was 11% for whites and 3-4% for blacks. We were talking in those demographic terms. Today, as you know, the percentages are very different in terms of participation, in that 30% of Americans have graduated from a 4-year college. And if you break it down by the different groups, the highest achievement group would be of Asian background, and they have about 55% with a college degree. But some Asian groups are not doing as well. Some are. And then Latinos, it's only 20%. For blacks, it's about 30%. And for whites, it's about 40%. Now, here's my point. So in the late 60s and early 70s, when I went off after Hampton to the University of Illinois, literally 90% of Americans had not seen anybody in their families graduate from college. Today, we're up to about a third of Americans across the board, across groups. And so when often people will say to me, that couldn't be true. Everybody I know has a college degree. Well, grad students are around grad students, tech people are around tech people, and they often have a degree. Lawyers are around lawyers. We're around people who have similar backgrounds. But the fact is that the majority of Americans and the vast majority of Americans of color have not earned a 4-year degree. And so that's if you think about the evolution of higher education, and it came about because of certain legislative acts, the Higher Education Act, the Pell Grant Act, and what it said was you didn't have to have money or be rich to go to college. And so that's a part of the story of my story and of the story of American higher education. The only other point I would make is that throughout my life, I have been excited about math. I am a mathematician. I get goosebumps doing math. And I've always wanted to figure out how to help more people in general, more women, but especially more Blacks and Latinos, Native Americans excel in STEM, to want to do something in math, science, engineering, computing. That's my story, my research, and my life.
This is fascinating because I came from India. And when I think about America, I thought everybody goes to college. Everybody has a degree. And after living in the country for so long, I come to know about all these things. Like a lot of people don't even have internet access even today. A lot needs to be done. On that note, in terms of diversity, I think I remember the story you telling us about how you and Jackie, your wife, used to be one of the very few African-American students at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign during your grad school days.
I would see them. There'd be others there, but the percentages were very small. And I would look into the students traveling from one class to another, and I'd see one light brown face, and it'd be my new wife. Very true. And I've been back since then, and they are working to increase those numbers. They are.
Yeah. If you were to rank the progress made in terms of diversity in higher education since the 70s till today, like on a scale of 1 to 10, what would that look like?
I would say, first of all, we define diversity more broadly today. In the civil rights movement, people were thinking Blacks, and then we came to understand the growing population of Latinos, of Hispanics, and of course, women's issues. And all of those are as important as ever. But now we have LGBTQ. We're in the process of seeing what the Congress will do with marriage equality, for example. We have issues involving physical disabilities. We talk about people with different religions, people coming from other countries. And so I give us a reasonable grade of a B- for at least acknowledging the need to focus on this broad diversity, that we do need people from other countries, that we need to have more students from all racial and ethnic backgrounds in this country. We need more women in computing, those areas. So we are talking about those issues, and we've spent billions of dollars working on them. We still have a long way to go. I would say two things. For first generation college students, I'd give us at best a C-, because the majority of first generation college students today who start college are not necessarily graduating from a 4-year institution. And then we have to think about our community colleges, who do a lot of good for our campus. Since 40% of Americans start in community colleges, and we know graduation rates, 4- and 2-year institutions are not what they need to be. In fact, we tend to say 60% for 4-year institutions over a 6-year period will graduate, but it's not. That's very misleading, Naresh, because of the most prestigious institutions, public and private, will have perhaps high 80s to 90% graduating. But the vast majority of institutions, particularly public institutions, will have graduation rates well below 50%. And those are going to often be working class people. I would say at best, when thinking about all these groups, in terms of progress, I'd give us a C+ in terms of where we need to go. And I would talk about maybe a 7 at best. But when talking about how far we have to go, I would take it down to a 6. And meaning we've arrived. We have a long way before we arrive. We need to know that any child born from any background in any zip code in our country has a reasonable chance of doing well enough in school to go to college and succeed and graduate. We cannot say that right now. We have a lot of work to do.
This realistic perspective is very important because we need to know what the challenges are going forward, and putting it at 6, I think it's a great observation there. I think going from here is going to be tougher. Maybe the first, like always, like getting a product till the 90% mark is easier. Getting that last 10% is really hard. And an extension of that is like, as an outsider, you've been in academia. If you look at the tech industry, what have your observations been in terms of progress they made in terms of diversity and inclusiveness?
So let me just say that, first of all, I follow the work of Jobs for the Future, which says everybody doesn't need to go to a four-year institution to do well. There are great opportunities for people who get AA degrees from community colleges, who get special certifications and can work in the tech industry. And so I'm not, even though I'm President Emeritus of a research university, UMBC, and we lead the country among predominantly white institutions in producing Blacks who get PhDs in STEM areas. And yet I would say college is not for everyone. And at the same time, that there are other ways of getting the skills needed to get a good job, that the liberal arts are important, but again, for everyone, at the same time, it does not make sense to think we all take that cookie cutter approach. I like the tech industry's approach of giving people chances, whether they're from college, graduated, or whether they can prove themselves and their competence and certifications. I like that. But what I would say is we've done abysmally poorly when thinking about getting more people of color into the tech industry, abysmally. And when you think about California, as an example, we know the percentages are very small, and we know the challenges with affirmative action in California and now with the rest of the country. And so I don't even use that word as much because people have different meanings of what they mean. So we don't need to go there with that. But what I am saying is we can do much better as a country, as a higher education industry, as technology companies in educating people to get into the industry and do well. That's where we need to focus much more attention. Whether it's about having people who are getting certificate programs, getting degrees, being entrepreneurs, starting companies, we need proactive, coherent approaches to achieve those goals.
Absolutely. And thank you for setting that stage. I think we can now jump into some of the burning questions. I hear people in the Valley in California, both academia and industry, they say doing diversity is hard, but doing anything important is always hard. You did things as the president of UMBC, which were hard. Maybe you can walk us through some of the most challenging situations that you encountered since you took on as a president and lessons learned from solving those challenges.
So when I moved to UMBC, the majority of students who started in STEM as a freshman did not graduate in STEM. They either failed out of the institution or changed their majors. Well, as I looked around the country, I saw that was a national challenge. In fact, we call the first year or two of STEM weed out courses. Even at NSF, they acknowledge that the vast majority. I chaired the National Academy's Committee on Underrepresentation in STEM. And what I found was shocking. We had people on that committee from Harvard to Texas to Howard University and to MIT. And what we found was that two things. Number one, it didn't surprise us that only 20+% of Blacks and Latinos who began with a major in STEM would graduate in STEM. But we were stunned to see that only 32% of whites who began with a major in STEM graduate with a bachelor's in STEM. And for the highest achieving group, Asians, it was only 41%. So for every group, we see that people who start with the freshman level courses, the vast majority of people do not succeed. The first response was, well, they changed their majors to something that would give them more money, like business. But when we looked at the data, that was not the issue. The issue was students didn't do well in those first courses, first couple of years. They earned C's or below. And if you don't get at least a B in the lower level courses, it's really hard to do well in the upper level courses. And what we saw also, and then people said it was a K-12 problem because you see, Naresh, colleges blame high schools blame the elementary schools blame the family, and the husband says it's the wife's side of the family. But the fact is that even high-achieving high school seniors who start off in STEM tend not to earn a bachelor's degree in STEM. And what we saw that was really interesting was the more prestigious the university and the higher the test scores of students entering, the greater the chance that student who starts in STEM might change that major. So my big joke is people start off in pre-med and they become pre-law after a year or two. They get that C in chemistry because law is the other area that everybody considers very prestigious. And it was eye-opening to us. And what it said is something that led me to do a couple of TED Talks. One is on the 4 pillars of success in STEM. The other is on changing the culture in STEM. And the point in both is that we have to change the culture of our teaching and learning in STEM areas to get away from the cutthroat approach, to get away from the idea that most people will not succeed, because it hurts the country dramatically when you think about the small percentage of students in America graduating with majors in natural sciences and engineering. We need many more.
I think that is eye-opening for a lot of people. People don't understand that, I think. And how did you address that issue? I'm thinking, I know a lot of people in the tech industry that drop out in the first year. There's so many things I can talk about the culture, which we will get to. But what did you do specifically at UMBC to address that problem there?
Yes, we decided that we wanted to look at best practices throughout higher education. And we asked the question, what could we do, Naresh, to make sure that students of color not only succeeded in those first courses, but excelled? Because we wanted to produce students who would be so excited about the STEM work that they'd want to go and get PhDs, because we saw we needed more people on the faculties and in research environments to show that it's possible that it can be done, to set an example for others. And we said, if we could show, for example, that Blacks could do really well and go on to these PhDs, we would learn things that would help us with students of all races and all backgrounds. And so we did a lot of experimenting, and we came up with these basic guiding principles, I would call them, that I talk about in my TED Talk. First is high expectations, not only of the students, but of ourselves. If most students are not succeeding in a class, the question is, did the professor really teach the class? Did the professor teach effectively the concepts in that course? Or did the teacher simply present the material? Because if most students are not making it, that means they didn't learn the concepts, which ineluctably means the concepts were not taught effectively somehow. And so, number one, high expectations of both faculty and students. Number two, building community among people. Very important, just because too often in STEM we're cutthroat. I'm thinking, if teacher grades on the curve, I'm not going to tell you what I know, because you may not tell me what you know. And so you get the A and I get the C. But if we have a standard that we want people to come to, then people can work together to help each other grasp the concepts and master the work. And number three, it takes people in science or in technology to pull people into the work. You can have students working, but when you got faculty working with them on projects in companies or in labs, it makes all the difference in the world. It takes a computer scientist to produce a computer scientist. You get that help. Then finally, we have to be honest about rigorous evaluation. The newest book my colleagues and I wrote, The Empowered University, is about being empowered to look in the mirror at self and be honest. What are we doing well? What are we not doing well? And what's the tough stuff we have to do to improve? That's the point. How do we make sure we're being honest with ourselves about what else we need to do? And that's the approach we use. That turned out to be the Hrabowski Scholars Program. A wonderful engineer who's now 98 and still involved with the program, Robert Mauhoff, was supported from the beginning, wanted to do something to help us, to help at the time, first Black males, because he said everything he saw on TV about Black males was about sports or about prison. And he said, what else can we do? And we were concerned about the paucity of Blacks in science and engineering, and we married the ideas. And so for 30-some years, we've worked on that issue and been able to show that we could produce large numbers of students of color and learn lessons that would help students of all backgrounds. That's what we've done.
Phenomenal. You bring up so many important points there. I mean, having expectations both from the students and from the faculty, super important. You're just not looking at one population and blame it on one, but then the wholesome approach, the systems thinking that is absolutely needed to change things and building that community aspect of it. I know you used to talk so much about that community. You can get isolated.
Really, we're connected to each other, and we should not be comfortable when most people are not succeeding. What can we do to help those students? And we need to make sure the students know what they need to do, because while I talk about high expectations of faculty, Hrabowski scholars and students at UMBC work really hard. They work very hard. And I think it may be helped by the fact that 60% of our undergraduates have at least one parent from another country. Something about the international influence that increases the intensity, the hunger for the work. I think we're better when we have people from all over the world showing just how hard human beings can work, because we in this country after generations can become very comfortable. And there's no time for comfort. We have to be saying, no, we can be better. We can be better. So we talk at UMBC about the grit, the idea that we could get knocked down, but we get right back up and we persevere. We keep going. We keep asking for help. That has made the difference for us. And we see that in the success of our students.
Yeah, I think that's a nice segue to talk about Meyerhoff program that you mentioned very briefly. I think it's a national model for other universities around the country. I know Mike Summers goes around giving talks, and you do too. Can you say more about the origin and evolution of the program over the years?
Sure. As I mentioned before, Bob Meyerhoff wanted to work with us to help with students of color and Black males in particular, but we added to that women and people of color. But the program did start for African Americans. And then we added these other groups of people, including some white students in the Meyerhoff, white and Asian, who have an interest in understanding issues of underrepresentation. We need people of all racial and ethnic backgrounds understanding the challenges that people of color and women face in these issues, so that when they become leaders, they know what we can do to pull more into the work. That's a part of the tech industry's problem. Most experts have not had a chance to think about what does it take to get more people from underserved, underrepresented groups into this work, you see. And so from the beginning, we were asking that question. We were working with those students. We had faculty, colleagues, and staff working to give them support. And we would learn things that would help us to reshape the program as time went on. For example, at first, some students thought, well, I got a bachelor's. I've done better than anybody in my family. I'm out of here. And we had to think of ways other students, though, knew we wanted them to get PhDs to become the top leaders to help. Others, we worked with them and they got grad degrees. They went into the tech industry and they've started companies, for example, which is also something we wanted to do. We wanted to increase the number who would go to the professoriate, who would become a part of just researchers in STEM, but also those who'd be entrepreneurs, all of three, which are very, very important. Entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs, those who go and work at the Googles and other places, but also others who would start their own companies. And I'll give you the name of Austin Murdoch, PhD from Berkeley, young man of color who literally has his own company now, 5Map, and he's been in the Silicon Valley areas, moving back here to the Baltimore-Washington corridor, as an example. Or Delali Sarasa, who has a company, Fearless Solutions, who started in our research park. We've got 130 companies in our research park at UMBC, who's now moved into the city, into Baltimore. And of the 130 companies in the research park, about a quarter have women as CEOs, and a quarter have people of color, heavily Black and Latino, as CEOs. So the Meyerhoff program led to more students going on for grad degrees, but also to people going into STEM fields, including entrepreneurship.
That is a phenomenal journey. It just reminds me of the flywheel effect. Jim Collins, the author of the book Good to Great, because you didn't wake up one day and everything happened. It happened over 3 decades. Maybe you can recall some small wins and lessons from your tenure over 3 decades that resulted in the big wins, because now they have the momentum. It'll go on.
Yeah. If you look at the end result, we now have students in bioengineering on the faculty at Stanford, in immunology at Harvard. The first Black woman to create a vaccine, who partnered with Barney Graham and led the NIH team, Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, who's now at Harvard, is one of our UMBC Meyerhoffs. The young man who has invented a pacemaker for the brain, who's tenured faculty at Duke, Kafui Zarasa, is another great example, coming out of chemical engineering and MD, PhD. Now, I start with that to say, your point is well taken. They just weren't produced. It took years, decades of developing this program. And I'll just give you one example of what people can do. We need to look for early wins, because people don't think something is possible if they've not seen it. When I first moved to UMBC, I asked people to find the transcripts of Blacks from this country who had earned A's at upper level science and technology courses. There were none. And when my colleagues fought back and they gave me names, they were all people of color, Blacks, who had been educated in other countries. French-speaking country, a British-speaking country, in the islands or in Africa. But when you're talking about kids from New York or DC for generations, no, there were none. And so one of the things that some people said was it will take a generation or two for it to happen. My response was, I thought we were scientists. And they're, what do you mean? I said, well, usually we base results on evidence, on some experimenting, and then the conclusions resulting from the evidence. You're saying it will take a generation or two is simply based on your limited anecdotal information that you've not seen any. Because it is hard when you've not seen people excelling in computer science who are Black or Latino. You don't know it's possible. So I said, let's see what we can do to make it happen. And one of our first goals was to have students, to make sure students got the support they needed, and that we chose those with a background solid enough that we could keep building it up so that they could earn some A's. And so I threw out a challenge that was very upsetting to people. I said, we've never had a Black from this country earn an A in genetics. And whites got upset with me saying, why would you embarrass us like that? Blacks got upset with me and said, why would you embarrass us like that? And I said, as a mathematician, to solve a problem, you have to state it. And the fact is, we hadn't had, and that's one of those courses for the life sciences that's important. And after the first year, we did get some B's, but we still hadn't had an A. It took 3 years before we got the first A in genetics. And I'm in this focus group over pizza with students, and I announced it, and all these guys jumped up because they knew they had gotten the A, and it turned out it was a young woman. And all of a sudden, when I called her name, everybody was in shock just because they knew we hadn't had one before. And I watched their faces as tears, if you can imagine, tears flowing down their faces, because it was saying, here's somebody who looks like me, who earned an A in genetics. And they gave her a standing ovation. It was like breaking a barrier. It was running a race the fastest ever. Because once the barrier was broken, people knew I can do this too. And that was true in the life sciences. It was true in computer science courses. It was true in engineering. And as people began to see others doing really well, they were no longer satisfied with a C or even a B sometimes. They wanted to do really well. And it was that process of breaking those barriers, and sometimes not, and deciding what else can we do to help to get there, right? That led to the success we have today.
Fascinating stories there. Thank you for sharing some of the stories. And 3 big takeaways from this last 2 minutes of your talk is, one, you need to acknowledge that there is a problem and design experiments. Look for evidence, small wins. Don't get carried away by big narratives. Naysayers come up with those things. And acknowledge the fact that when you're trying something hard, it takes a long time.
It's absolutely true. And I will tell you, some of the articles we've written in Issues in Science and Technology will tell people the names of the universities that have had some success with Blacks and Latinos in producing bachelor's recipients who can go on and get PhDs. Now, those same institutions will be great for recruiting people at the bachelor's level or master's level because they've created a climate where they've had more success. We're the #1 producer for Blacks. What's interesting is that sometimes people go to institutions just because they think, well, there are plenty of people there, plenty of Blacks there. The question is, do they have the record from the data analysis to say they've sent students on to get the PhD, for example, or to companies that have done really well in those companies? Very important to identify sources of students. That's why I'm always pushing UMBC, saying to people, you want to find students of any race, any background, you can come to our campus. And what I like is that you will find them from those groups, but they also know how to work with people from other groups, which is another one of those skills that companies look for, the ability to work well in the sandbox with others. Yes.
That's a nice segue to talk about what the tech industry calls as the pipeline problem. It's easy for companies to view the lack of diversity in tech as a pipeline problem or a legacy issue. It's a very comfortable diagnosis, That would mean that it's somebody else's problem, and goes back to something you mentioned earlier about blaming it on the high schools, colleges, wife side of the family, and so on. But Freeman, you took the problem head on and actually built one of the largest pipelines of African-American students and engineers who go on to earn doctorates in natural sciences and engineering than any other college in the country, which is a phenomenal achievement, filling that pipeline. What are the lessons learned from your own journey addressing the problem that the tech industry might pick some lessons from?
I love telling people, yes, we've got that recognition as the number one producer of Blacks, but what that also says is that my white and my Asian students and my Latino students are also doing really well too. It's great to be able to say, when you find a culture where one group is doing well, you will find a culture where they've helped students of all backgrounds. I start there. For companies, I'm always saying the most enlightened companies that work with us are working with our students after the freshman year. They are literally having them as interns starting in their sophomore year, end of the freshman year, to get a chance to see the talent that we have. They're working with our master's students and our PhD students to identify talent and to see people with the kind of personalities and interests that will fit well with the company. And so the pipeline issue is the responsibility of everyone. Yes, universities and schools have to be preparing people, but we need employers working collaboratively with those institutions to work to coach, support, and encourage students at every level. The National Security Agency is a perfect example. We have a lot of students who start working at NSA while they're still in high school, of all backgrounds, and then they work as interns throughout the year and in the summer at NSA. The same thing with a company like Northrop Grumman, defense industry. They work very closely with us on many levels, including middle school and STEAM activities in some of the inner city schools, but in Northrop Grumman, young scholars, women and people of color, in cyber and in other areas. So I would argue that the pipeline issue is one, not just for education, but for the private sector and for those who are employers. Very important.
Yeah. And two things come out again. One, you need to spend the time and the effort to fill the pipeline. It's not somebody else's responsibility. It is your responsibility. Acknowledge that and put some effort into that.
It's so important. And if we can embrace that notion that it is all of us working together, we can identify people who not only have potential, but who've developed skills. It's amazing how enriching internships can be to students because it shows them the connection between what happens in the classroom and what happens in the real world. Very important. Very, very important.
Speaking of internships, and that's a nice place to talk about hiring. When somebody at a tech company is trying to hire, they usually come up with a job profile for the candidate. A practice I've seen in the Valley is that people profile it to themselves. The general thought process goes something like this. I know what I'm good at. I value it very highly, and I can test for it in an interview very well. When you do that, everybody looks and works alike and results in a lack of diversity.
Yeah, it is the human condition. We tend to connect most comfortably with people like ourselves. I would say true leadership means learning how to understand people who are different from oneself and how to connect with them in such a way that you pull them into the work also and build relationships so you can have honest communication about what's working and what's not working. That is the more enlightened leader. The easiest thing for me to do is to go find people who look just like me and say, yeah, they're great. And they could be great, but I'm saying it takes effort to say, my way is not the only way, and that I want to be fair in giving people who are not like me a chance to show what they can do. We want the highest of standards, academic standards, of intellectual matters, but right now, it is a part of the human condition. People tend to find people just like themselves from their institutions, even. There's an assumption that if you're not from certain institutions, you won't be as good. And I would say, don't be constrained by your anecdotal information. You need to know more about the quality of each institution. Don't assume you know, because you really don't. When I say that a number of my students are now in the faculties of Ivies all the way out to Stanford, and we are UMBC, I'm very proud of that. The fact that we know the quality is such that people go on to PhD programs and do extremely well, and our own PhDs do well. The head of Hopkins APL, Applied Physics Lab, which is about almost half the budget of all of Johns Hopkins University, is a PhD in computer science from UMBC. Wonderful white male who is absolutely brilliant, who will tell anybody, if you want a great graduate education, come to UMBC. Well, the typical person in California does not know that. They have no sense. I'm always teasing colleagues and saying, don't be so arrogant as to assume you know who we are. Get to know the quality, and then you can make a judgment.
Yeah. You bring up a good point. Like, people think when you talk about diversity, should we lower the bar when you're hiring somebody? I've been at UMBC and people used to joke, if you want a good grade, easier grade, go to College Park. But if you want to learn something, stay at UMBC.
I'm not commenting on that because both are great schools. Wait a minute.
I got nothing against them. I'm just saying it's the point that, it's not about lowering the bar. It's helping people get to that bar. And you offered academic, social, and financial support. Maybe I can elaborate on that subject of, you didn't lower the bar. How exactly can the companies address this issue like you did?
Yes. We have to make sure that students from underrepresented groups, underserved, have the financial support they need to do well. You cannot wait tables and do biochemistry or computer science and do them both well. It takes financial support for students to excel in what we know are difficult majors, computer science, as an example, biochemistry, whatever they are. And the fact is, though, so we work to get financial support for them and to make sure any work they're doing is related to an academic internship. When students are working in computing, whether on campus or in companies in the research park or in general, they're getting to be strong and stronger in the academic work. That's different from doing something totally different from the major that they're serving. So we do need both paid internships, academic scholarships, and then support from people who are experts. It takes computer scientists to produce computer scientists. A person can be really good on his or her own, but a person can be much better if somebody pulls them into that work. It makes such a difference. It really does.
Completely agree with that point. It does take a computer scientist to train another computer scientist. Having said that, I want to go back to something we talked around hiring practices. How does one expand the job profile of a potential hire beyond that of the person hiring? Maybe you can talk about what you have done at UMBC around hiring practices to facilitate diversity. And any observations in terms of the outcomes will be very helpful.
I think that companies can learn from very successful companies that have hired people of color and done a good job, and from people of color in the particular field. And so having a chance to have advisory groups who will help in identifying institutions where you can find good talent, having people who've been successful in the company from different racial backgrounds who can give advice, and most important, having the tough conversations about what does it take to stop hiring people who just look like us. It has to be the tough conversation because people they just assume that's what you do. Somebody from your school, or somebody as a family friend, and it's another white male, for example, and you just hire them, and that's fine. And there's nothing wrong with that. The question is, what talent are you not taking? Who is it that's not benefiting from this? And how do you know that somebody with a very different perspective can't enrich the conversation and the problem solving? That's it. You need a chance, whether it's about more women or people of color. Very important.
Absolutely. Speaking of hiring somebody who looks like yourself, this is another observation I've been making, talking to other people in the tech industry here. They say they're not maximizing opportunity, but instead trying to minimize risk. If you believe in it, the more different you are, the riskier the person is. And if you had a choice to hire between a white male student who went to Stanford, I got nothing against them, just anecdotally, and a female black geneticist or an engineer who went to UMBC, who I know is much better and less risky than Stanford one, industry decided to go with somebody from Stanford.
And clearly we have great confidence in Stanford and what they do. What I would say is this. I like to think about the genius of the and versus the tyranny of the or. That comes from Jim Collins. I see somebody hiring from both places. And I think if they don't know an institution like UMBC, the challenge is get to know them. In other words, have some interns well before they graduate with undergrad or master's or whatever, and see the quality. And that minimizes the risk. This is why internships can be so important, you see, or in training programs, when you work with an institution to say, give us some of your best, let us see what we think. And so we've been very fortunate to have some of our students of all races who do come to some of the tech companies in that area, and they're doing quite well. But it's just that you can get many more. The risk comes when you don't do your homework. If you do your homework as an employer and you get to know the institution, you get to know some of the faculty and the quality of their work, their research, and you have interns working on projects or people working on research in a case study or whatever in a class, you really get to see the quality of the thinking. So there are ways to minimize that risk in a way that leads to more success for the company.
Yeah. Speaking of giving a chance to somebody, I was talking to Dr. Rutledge, the Dean of Grad School at UMBC, and she said, hire well and treat them well. And she also mentioned, don't treat it as a way you're giving a chance to somebody, which is a deficit model. Hire for their strengths.
Yeah, it's a very good point. The key is to know enough about the person to see what strengths can be helpful to the company. That resilience, that having the perspective of women from different backgrounds, of people of color, can always help. But getting a chance to see problem-solving capacity of the person through a variety of approaches can really be helpful. And the more exposure the company has to people from certain backgrounds, certain institutions, the more confidently they can hire people of the type they want. But her point is there are many strengths that people don't realize. For example, someone who's been through a lot of adversity in life is not going to be like a deer in the headlights when things go badly. If you've always had green lights and you've been able to go through without having been stopped or knocked down, when the adversity comes, you're probably not able to give it the situation, the kind of careful analysis needed. But people who've had some diverse adversity in their lives, whether about health or about poverty or about discrimination, who've overcome those things, tend to have more emotional intelligence and can continue to be calm through the storm, because every company goes through those stormy pieces. I'm on corporate boards, and I know there are periods when we go through challenging times, all of us. And the people who are most valuable are those who have some reserve, who know how to handle themselves in the midst of adversity or in the midst of challenging situations in general. Very important.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many studies that show that diversity of thoughts, talents, and experiences result in better outcomes. I think somehow companies have to incorporate those and take that into factor. Speaking of some of the hiring practices, leads me to talk about unconscious bias. In thinking Stanford is better than UMBC, things happen like that. You know, they're just maybe unconscious. They just seen people from Stanford. They've done well historically, and so they don't look beyond. Like, how does a company address unconscious bias?
Sure. I think just being honest. I love your transparency and your honesty in saying that, because I would never be trying to put those two institutions, one is much older, one is younger, but we know our students do well when they come to Stanford or Harvard. We know that well, of all races. We know that, or Berkeley, or any of those institutions. And what I would say is that most important, people need to look at the data. They need to evaluate performance of people. They need to look at, using analytics, using focus groups. They need to know more about the quality of the product of any institution, to take the time to say, okay, we've had 8 people from this institution. What can we say about their performance? What have we learned about their performance? Are there ways in which they can be better, regardless of institution? Years ago, we worked hard to work with employers to get their feedback. Years ago, one of the things said about our students was that in some of the engineering areas was that they're great technically, but they haven't learned to present with confidence. This was 25 years ago. We needed to work on their speaking and presentation skills, not just their ability to solve a technical problem. As an example, we're very proud. We are a nerdy campus. Let me just say that. So we've been national cyber champions several years ago, national mock trial champions in 21, beat Yale. But this year, I was really pleased just to hear we are the national chemical engineering champions for students for undergrad. We literally, big Jeopardy contest they have in chemical engineering, right? And our students were number 1. It's wonderful. It sounds a little kooky, a little nerdy, but that's who we are. That's what people don't realize. You can have a public institution that can be very nerdy, very nerdy. And again, I think the reason I really do believe one of the reasons we are so good is that we have the international influence, which others have. The difference is we've got the international influence coming out of everywhere from Asian to African countries, but we also have that influence of diversity coming out of DC, out of Washington, or people who grew up in military families in this country. So it's both international and domestic diversity. The richest of places will have the international diversity. We know that, people from all over the world. They just don't have Black kids out of LA, for example, or Latino kids from South Central. They don't have those populations also. We have both. And that makes us richer in our problem solving and interactions among different types of people. That's the point I would make.
Yeah. Slightly shifting gears, I think I'll be remiss not to talk about mentoring and the need for it. You mentioned it very briefly, and maybe you can talk about your own mentors as you were growing up at UMBC and what mentors did for me, at least. I think you're a mentor for me, and you found my weaknesses and helped me frame the problem and made me think about it. You don't have to solve the problem, I think. How does people from industry help?
Just speaking from the academic perspective, but also from the corporate world, since I serve on corporate boards, mentors are people who create an environment that allows and encourages even younger people, less experienced people to come and ask for help, for support, to ask questions, to learn about how to do things well. And it's very important to have mentors. You mentioned Mike Summers in biochemistry, National Academy's Howard Hughes investigator on our campus, and there are many others. But I would also say, and you'll appreciate this, you mentioned Dean Rutledge, who was the first Black woman to get a PhD in electrical engineering from Georgia Tech. She's been a mentor to so many people at the graduate level, and there's so many others. But this is the point, that mentors are important and champions are important. I want to make that distinction. The mentor is somebody to whom you can go and get advice and support, and who will tell you what they really think. A champion takes it to one step further, and that is the champion will knock down doors for you and say, now, here's the opportunity, show them what you can do, okay? What I have found is that really good mentors also can be great champions in saying to a colleague at another university or at a company, you really need to look at this person. This person has made a lot of progress and is far more talented than you may realize. Give the person a chance to show you what she or he can do. So we want both. We need good mentors and good champions. And people who succeed have always had both, whether they realize it or not. Somebody has given them a chance, whether they realize. Some people think, oh, I made it on my own. Nobody ever makes it on his or her own. I've always had wonderful mentors and champions who said, give Freeman a chance to show you what he can do. Bob Myhoff was a wonderful champion who's not just wealthy, but a brilliant MIT graduate who said, I believe in this young man. Give him a chance so he can show you what he can do. That's the idea.
Wow, you bring up such an important point. Having those champions is super, super important. And you mentioned about weaknesses. Maybe we should talk about it. When you go to an interview, people try to cover their weaknesses and talk about strengths. And Colin Powell talks about hiring for strengths, not lack of weaknesses. Everybody has weaknesses, but you just didn't see them during the interview.
Yes, I knew Colin Powell well. His wife is from my hometown of Birmingham. I know them well. What I would say is that we need to be able to talk comfortably about areas where we can continue to improve. And I'll give you an example. For me, I always worked too hard. It was a strength in that I was producing, but I always would take it too far, and it would have an impact on my health. So when I'm working with new presidents in the Harvard program, I'm telling them, I don't care how productive you are and how high your standards are, you must take care of yourself personally. We were talking about sleep. It was a fact. I just wasn't getting enough sleep. It paid off in many ways, but I needed to learn. I needed to get a little more sleep. It is important. And so being able to say what areas one needs to improve in tells you a lot about that person's knowledge of self. We want people who are self-aware. Very important. So it's a good point. It's a very good point.
Self-awareness, super, super important. And that takes me back to one of the points you mentioned about culture. On the subject of building culture and incorporating diversity, I don't know if you heard the story about the giraffe and the elephant. Giraffes are tall in a slender building, and it was raining outside. Very few elephants were getting drenched. Giraffes feel sorry for them and then ask them to come into the building. After some time, elephants say, we can't see through the windows. They're too high. Giraffes say, grow your necks. Then the elephant says the walls are too tight. Can you do something about it? You'd have to say lose weight, perform intermittent fasting or keto diet. And I bring up the story because this is what tech companies are doing, I think, at a higher level. They hire African Americans and other people of other diverse population, but act as if nothing has changed. They be themselves instead of accommodating them. What could an organization do to be inclusive and welcome people to stay in the tech cultures?
Listening to the voices of people who are different can be very important. In our book, The Empowered University, we talk about having retriever courage. The name of our Chesapeake Bay Retriever is True Grit, and our mascot. And retriever courage means the courage to hear things you may not want to hear. And it goes to your point that when you bring in people who are different, more women, more people of color, they may find some things off-putting. And it doesn't mean everything has to change, but you need to at least know how people are perceiving the environment. Sometimes they may be seeing accurately, sometimes maybe not, but perceptions matter. They really do. And are they feeling welcome? Do they get the impression you only hired them because they were of color? Is there a recognition that they bring value to the company? And so having the tough conversations can be very helpful. In the book, we quote Eric Weiner in his book, The Geography of Bliss, but I talk about it in my book, The Empowered University. And he says, culture is the sea we swim in, so all-consuming. We fail to recognize it until we step out of it and to look back at ourselves. So the Empowered University means what? The Empowered Company. It is being empowered to look in the mirror itself and to be honest and to listen to the different voices as they talk about what's working and what's not working. And not to assume because the environment is great for me, it will be great for you. Very important. And I think places, institutions, organizations, companies, universities that are enlightened understand they can always be better. We knew, at UMBC, we say success is never final. We can always be better. And if we are bringing in some people of color and they're leaving, do we understand why they're leaving, for example? And what lessons can we learn as we bring in more? Because the world is becoming, as you know, increasingly diverse, and we need people believing that they are part of the solution, not just a part of the problem. Best example is COVID. Many people of color did not believe in the vaccine because they didn't trust medicine or science. Too many examples of people who used people of color. And it was Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett, our graduate, who led that team with Bonnie Graham at NIH that I mentioned, but she called and said, I'm having a challenge. We're trying to find more Blacks to be in the study, the pilot study, so we can show that the vaccine works for people of color and for Blacks. Would you be willing to be in it? And so my wife and I agreed to do it because we believe in Kizzmekia and because we do believe in science. And then we went on TV talking about it. We had the vaccine. We're doing well. You need to trust it. And we could say, look at the photo of this woman who created the vaccine. And when all these people, Black and white, saw this Black face, they're going, what? Because nobody's ever thought about a Black woman creating a vaccine, you see. And when they saw her with 2 presidents now coming to her lab to look at it, and now see her up at Harvard, all of a sudden, little girls of all races are saying, I want to be Dr. Kizzmekia Corbett. It's wonderful. And I want to create a vaccine. And so it means people are seeing themselves in the work. And there's the ineluctable question. What are we doing to make sure that our children and young people from underrepresented groups are seeing themselves in the technology world? I was at a really big company in the last couple of months, tech company, and that has bases out in your area. Every time I saw an underrepresented person, I knew that person was in a lower level job. Some were working with the coffee stands. Somebody else was working on the floors. You get my point. It's easy for people to go past that every day without realizing small numbers of women, and then the people in power, white and some Asian guys, certain parts of Asia at the top, which is good, but where are the other people coming up the ladder, the Latinos, the Blacks, the Native Americans? And it can be done. It takes the kind of serious attitude that we use in solving math problems, or that we use in finding a vaccine for COVID, or we use in solving cyber problems. It's not about warm and fuzzy. That's the point I want to make. it's not just about what's morally right. It is about what will protect us. The intelligence community gets this. They do want people from all kinds of backgrounds. I am very proud of General Nakasone, the head of NSA. He's been very clear when he invites me over. We need people of all backgrounds helping us look at how we solve problems to protect our country. And in healthcare, we need people who can convince people that they need to be a part of the solution and trust us so we can prevent death, so we can help with healthcare issues. Same thing in technology broadly. It's a matter of urgency given the increasing broadening of our population in this country. People from other places, people growing up in our cities and rural areas, all of them need to be a part of technology.
Absolutely. It looks like there's a huge need for role models, for sure. That definitely helps. And I know we're running low on time. Before we go to the last closing questions, I know you've been leading the Meyerhoff program at UMBC, and I know about the 13 tenets. If we have to create a hypothetical toolbox for tech companies, what would those tools look like, the basic tools look like in that?
I would tell them to look at my TED Talk and look at this research on Meyerhoff and any of these articles and issues in science and technology, because there's several things. We need to produce communities of scholars, and they don't have to be all from underrepresented groups, but they should be with some people who are interested in understanding how to pull more people from those groups into the work. So you can have whites and Asians and blacks and Latinos, Native Americans, LGBTQ, all of that, but some blacks and Latinos for sure, men and women who are working on technical problems, but who also become known as ambassadors for technology to pull more people into the work. So our Center for Women in IT, CWIT scholars, these are women and some men who go out to help people on not just on the campus, but in the schools to say, we want you to become really good as a girl in coding, for example, or as a person of color. So having these communities of people with that extra attachment of broadening participation as experts, as some of the best, as a strengths-based model, not as a deficit model, as a strengths-based model, and then having the opportunity to create a culture that encourages people to say what they really think. I love this fact about tech people. It's like mathematicians. We tend to say what we think. We just shoot it out. Sometimes it's considered a little cold or a little harsh, but you get the real deal. Well, it's fine to do that as long as you can also say, yeah, if there's something about the company that sucks for people of color, we need to know about it. We need to understand what we can do to be better and to make it as welcoming a work environment for people of all types. And then finally, we need to be constantly evaluating what works and what does not work. And with incentives for experts to serve as champions and mentors to understand these issues. I mean, if we could bring the level of gravitas to the question of broadening participation as we bring the things we really value, like making money, like saving lives, we could do this. And I, having come out of a civil rights era and having seen how much discrimination there can be in the world, I know we are better now than we were 40 years ago. I know that we can make progress in this area. And what do I say always? Keep hope alive. We can do this. We just have to give it some brain power. It's the brain power and the compassion that can make the difference.
That is some great advice and lots of tools. Freeman, this has been so much fun and tremendously helpful for me, and I'm sure for others listening. And what a gift to be able to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time. And I really hope we can continue this conversation down the lane, because we learn from each other. And I hope you can transmit the lessons that you learned to the industry and the world. Thank you so much.
You were such an amazing student leader at UMBC. I've always known you were going to do really well. I'm very proud of you. Okay?
You're very kind. Thank you.
Thank you, Naresh.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Lab to Startup podcast. You can find links to the resources and programs mentioned in these episodes, connect with Naresh, or subscribe to this show at labtostartup.com.